Okay, well, first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to be presenting and participating in this wonderful conference. And I thank Iona and Nabila for inviting me. And Iona, it's wonderful to see you after so many years. The last time we met was for a conference that I had organized at the Asia Research Institute in Singapore, and that was time flies. So it's really an immense pleasure to be here. And I look forward to all the rest of the plenaries and what sounds like an incredibly rich collection of panel presentations. So much to learn and to share. So I don't have a bunch of wonderful, lovely slides to show you the way that, or short clips of films or very informative cartoons. Just 3 slides just to drive home a couple of points, and I'll be talking mainly from my paper. But the gist of it is that this particular talk today is based on a project that Amira and I were involved in for 3 years, Gender and Violence in Urban Pakistan, and which was funded by IDRC and DFID. And we were looking at the intersections of violence, gender, and infrastructure across 3 cities, Rawalpindi and Islamabad, and Pakistan's largest metropolis, which is Karachi, a city of anywhere between 16 to 21 million, take a pick. It's always a controversy with numbers. So we've developed several publications out of that particular project. And this talk is based on a recent publication that Amira and I co-authored, in which I was very interested in issues of risk and security, and how notions or ideas of risk and security can also be gendered when it comes to infrastructure. So that's what, and these are really just ideas. There's nothing hard and fast here. It's just, to kickstart conversations on security and risk, but also issues that are very pertinent to a city like Karachi. So I'm not going to be talking about Rawalpindi and Islamabad. I'm going to be talking specifically about Karachi. So in our broader conversations and debates about the gendered infrastructures and related social, spatial, economic, and ecological reconfigurations in the post-colonial city, questions of risk and security are significant. In urban landscapes where histories of violence and militarization persist, and where informal infrastructure provisioning systems such as water, because that's what I'm going to be talking about today, are being securitized by the state, risk management and security practice appear to have become part of how the state maneuvers its way across complex landscapes of infrastructural planning and implementation. In such landscapes, many different realities of violence, of informalization, of securitization, of gentrification, of entrepreneurialism, and so forth, are entangled in messy ways. I take a cue from a city where I reside and work, Karachi, that has shaped my knowledge about gendered infrastructures, and especially about thinking, theorizing, and writing from a certain vantage point, where my knowledge is more intimate and reliable, and which has provoked a particular line of inquiry to highlight a unique context of securitization with effects that exacerbate the crisis of water provisioning. Karachi exhibits a post-colonial context where local and provincial governments are belated constructions with limited fiscal and human capacity and inadequate administrative systems at their disposal in the management of infrastructural delivery. It is very much a city that, in Abdul Malik Simon's and Edgar Petrus's words, denotes an empirical configuration of the South, where the urban majority holds political, economic, spatial, and ecological vulnerability. This vulnerability is striking when we consider water provisioning in a city of 20 million residents, where nearly 60% live in informal settlements, where water shortages, contaminations, and dry taps for hours combined with climate change-related heat waves have pushed ordinary citizens to live on the knife edge of water scarcity. Such settlements are often seen as threats to the city's and the nation's political stability, as risks to the city, but contain large concentrations of men and women living at risk. Akin to many cities in South Asia, Karachi's residents obtain water either by claiming rights through procedural channels or through informal and illegal processes, theft, corruption, or political negotiation, and they rely on a so-called water mafia that is especially prominent in the city's expanding informal settlements in the periphery. I take water security as a proxy for security more generally and endeavor to investigate how, in the politics of water provisioning, the imbrications of securitization and water governance have become pervasive given the context of Pakistan's protracted security predicament in the new millennium. Although I note here, but I don't have time to get into it, there is a much deeper context to this securitization, a historical context of the Cold War, post-colonial nation building, of nuclearization, and how security in Pakistan remains embedded in a narrow concept of threat and national advantage. In the contemporary context, I am referring to the lingering effects of the post-9/11 war on terror and prevailing discourses of terrorism and militants. This is pertinent in the context of a post-colonial city that has been Pakistan's security laboratory for several decades. And in the state's attempts to both regularize basic services and deal with urban security, it is largely the urban majority, especially those residing in informal settlements, that have been impacted in their struggles to locate water. As an example, I will just discuss briefly the case of a 25-year-old housewife and mother of 4 children who resides in a neighborhood called Ghaziabad, which is located in one of Karachi's largest informal settlements, Orangutan, population anywhere between 2.5 to 3 million. In June 2015, which was during our project when we were doing our ethnography and when we were on ground, just after a 5-day heat wave, Nusrat was deeply agitated as she couldn't locate water for her household. She angrily described how her household's dependence on private water tankers had been disrupted because of the paramilitary rangers' operations to wipe out the so-called water mafia. And she said, quote, "My children can't bathe, I can't cook or clean, can't wash clothes. Our lives have come to a standstill. You can't imagine our anger. The line has no water," and she was referring to the main utilities line, the Karachi Water and Sewerage Board, "and now we can't find a tanker. We have depended on water tankers supplied by the water mafia. But now there are hardly any tankers. Ever since the Rangers' operations started, the water supply has worsened," end quote. On another occasion, when we met again, Nusrat explained, quote, "Nowadays, if tankers deliver water, we ask, where is the water coming from? We know the hydrants are shut. A woman who lives a few lanes away from my house, her youngest child got sick, severe gastrointestinal sickness, after a water tanker delivery. Later, she learned it was wastewater from an ice factory. She had to pay expensive medical bills and seek help from neighbors and borrow money," end quote. The loss of her normal routine forced Nusrat to mitigate risk as she struggled to locate water. With the help of a local NGO, she formed a savings group to construct a borehole in the neighborhood lane. But this risk management strategy was hardly a boon. When the first borehole was constructed at 125 feet, the water came up bitter. The next, at 82 feet, brought water fit only for washing clothes and for mopping her household. So anxieties around risk and danger concerning water involve both women and men, and risk conditions the relations between residents, with paramilitary rangers, with designated water brokers, valve men, etc., and state representatives who compete for resources in what the feminist scholar Cynthia Enloe calls a game of masculinities. I highlight certain key interlocking and shifting security logics in Karachi. A right to water logic that is promoted by the judiciary, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. A national security or securitized water logic to contain terrorists and mafias who allegedly control water valves, hydrants, and tankers. I will elaborate this in a minute. And an entrenched everyday patriarchal logic that constrains women's mobilities, and finally, a human security logic to save lives from environmental risks promoted by NGOs. I suggest that gender maps the antagonisms between these different security logics that compound risks and insecurities for the everyday woman and man. And I take a feminist lens to understand, and I struggle to understand, how securitization logics impact access to water that must be secured. But this also relates more broadly to South Asian megacities where the realities of water provisioning are complex and opaque. In the past decade, Pakistan has made a drastic leap from protracted military rule to democratic governance. And in this moment, there is a great deal of talk about upholding its democratic ascendance as an advocate of human security, especially by championing universal water access. But the state also appears to be redefining and scaling back human security through a national security lens of risk management, by focusing on a discourse of terrorism that has enhanced the power of paramilitary forces to define the limits of water provisioning in cities like Karachi. Let me give you some examples. In November 2017, at the third international conference held in Karachi, the governor of Sindh stated, quote, "Terrorism is a way bigger issue than the water crisis. If someone suggested otherwise, they would be thrown out of the assembly," end quote. In a similar tone, in January 2018, the Chief Justice of Pakistan, in addressing the utility in Karachi, the Karachi Water and Sewerage Board, or KWSB, declared, quote, "Why is there a shortage of water in Karachi, and how come water tankers are not affected by it? Tankers will be shut down at any cost. Fulfill your obligations or quit. We will deal with the water mafia," end quote. These kinds of discursive interventions from key judicial and senior government representatives underscore that within the story of risk perception, while the state uses the language of universal water access, in practice, it deviates from a human security approach. It privileges the threat of non-state armed groups over that posed to millions of residents, persistent water shortages where poor and low-income residents are disproportionately affected. I suggest that this materializes through the state's monopolization of the risk discourse in relation to the politics of water provisioning. To this end, the masculinized tropes of terrorist, militant, and mafia have become a key instrument of state power. And let me delve into this securitization story a bit more, because it kind of dovetails with the question of illegal water provisioning at the neighborhood level. So whether designated as legal or illegal, water is brokered by the state. Karachi's so-called water tanker hydrant mafia comprises a constellation of actors that straddle the state-non-state divide. Tanker operators create artificial crises in alliance with water utility officials to expand their business potential. So a male respondent from an informal settlement who was a part of our project, where we were also doing carrying out participant photography, which Amira was very, very instrumental in facilitating, took this photograph of an illegal pump station and noted, quote, "This is an artificially created water shortage. There is no real shortage of water, just an active mafia," end quote. Now, it would be straightforward to comprehend this dynamic in terms of an absent state and an extant water mafia, an explanation that I believe easily slides into the common trope of state failure. But such a reading elides the securitization logics that condition access to water in cities like Karachi. I take logics of security as a notion of discursive power that circulates and reconfigures state governance, with risk as a political rationality that governs according to predictive calculations of future harm. This discursive power can be understood through utility-sanctioned water brokers as the dominant provisioning pathway, which signals the messy entanglements of water brokers and state officials, drawing both into subversive forms of political agency and contingency based on quiet negotiations. With the water tanker hydrant mafia's reach expanding, especially into informal settlements in the periphery, KWSB has now become a bulk supplier. And this has led to the increased presence of local strongmen or water brokers in informal settlements. And they are often backed by regionally powerful political parties, often violent political parties, in the form of union councillors and valvemen, local leaders, middlemen, or strongmen. Note the gender dynamic. These figures play an important role in the financing of new water supply schemes and timing water deliveries through private tankers. The valvemen are often perceived as manipulative, predatory, opportunistic figures who take advantage of the community's goodwill as gaming the system and acting deviously and illegally, while the vulnerable, especially women, children, and those with disabilities, are considered passive victims of this corrupt masculine force. These actors constitute an essential, albeit fraught, conduit for the flow and control of water in Karachi. Men in communities use force to defend their families and their communities and households against the danger caused by a water shortage, for which the valvemen are often held responsible. This security logic at the neighborhood level is informed by a patriarchal notion of masculinity as protectors of family, community, and is calculated as a lower risk option than allowing their community or households to continue struggling without water. But in the hierarchy of males who police and protect, it is the paramilitary rangers who, because of their authoritarian, elite, professionalized security, trigger the greatest anxiety. When he took this photograph of a legal water hydrant controlled by the rangers, Umar noted, quote, "This is a legal hydrant, so you cannot go close or the rangers take the camera," end quote. A feminist-informed interrogation of the security state locates these actors within gendered and militarized practices that shape water provisioning in informal settlements in Karachi. And this feminist lens allows us to remain mindful of the gendered politics of security, the realities of which support a statist brand of patriarchal security. This vision of national security, which Cynthia Enloe astutely calls masculinized and statist, rivals the human security notion of danger associated with environmental risk, security, even disaster. The presence of informal water brokers in Karachi has activated state anxieties about security, as these actors are seen to operate outside of the state apparatus and to collude with terrorists. This is framed by the state sometimes as a human security issue, risking individual citizens' abilities to access their basic needs. Noteworthy are media and security experts who envision possible terrorist futures. In Karachi, security premediation, and premediation is a term coined by the scholar Richard Gruson and a term developed further by scholars such as Mariki de Goede, denotes the discursive economies through which uncertain terrorist futures are imagined. It fosters a landscape of securitized water as the state endeavors to eradicate water mafias, criminals, and terrorists who allegedly control the water supply. What is the difference between risk management and premediation? From what I've read from Mariki de Goede's work, both straddle the paradox of celebrating uncertainty while desiring to eliminate it. But as Goede asserts, premediation isn't about getting the future right. It's more about imagining a variety of futures in order to enable action in the present. These futures are likely or far-fetched, long-haul or imminent. What drives premediation is an imagined catastrophe, a multiplication of disaster scenarios that play out, especially in the media and even in judicial discourses, that generate specific kinds of governance effects and policies. This is precisely how judicial action concerning the eradication of water mafias works in Karachi to enable the right to water by emphasizing a call to action in the present. If the real disaster of terrorist-controlled water networks cannot be managed and foreseen, then at least the imagined disaster can provoke the competence of the authorities, such as the judiciary. Besides, judicial action intersects with and amplifies the national security logic of securitized water, as it provides succor to the masculinized elite paramilitary range's efforts to eradicate mafias and terrorists. Since 2015, the Supreme Court-backed paramilitary operations have shut down alleged illegal hydrants in peripheral settlements such as Orangi Town and attempted to break the water mafia. Regarding the city's periphery, the media reports the water mafias are militants, a greater threat because billions of rupees earned from illegal water are being channeled into terrorist activities in Karachi. While the citywide paramilitary operation was initiated in 2013 to bring down violence, particularly in connection with terrorism and criminal activities, by extending the operation's remit to water, the state's and media's discourse has blurred the boundary between water mafia and militant. In thinking about the relationship between security risk and gender, I take a cue from Paul Amar's and Cynthia Enloe's gendered conception of state governance that critiques the state's power to rescue and police, notably of patriarchal security states such as Pakistan, which not only sit on an authoritarian democratic spectrum, but have been at the front line of the war on terror. While the paramilitary operation has brought down levels of non-state violence and crime in Karachi, the remit of state violence has expanded. As the discourse of terrorist militant dovetails with the water mafia, the specter of threat is amplified. A senior KWSP official, which is the utility, notes that the paramilitary rangers are the only force that can, quote, abolish these water hydrants and water mafias and underground network of water pipelines for the city's peace, end quote. Ironically, more people in Karachi have died of water contamination and scarcity than terrorism. The Supreme Court's own militant rhetoric of shutting down illegal hydrants at any cost to ensure the right to water for citizens because, quote, the water crisis issue in Pakistan is turning into a bomb and the court will solve the problem, end quote, has boosted the rangers' efforts to unilaterally eliminate water supply threats. This shifting security logic has had distressing effects on socioeconomically and environmentally vulnerable populations and geographies where KWSP supply is absent or has dried up. In the periphery, the legally authorized closure of illegal hydrants has exacerbated its uncertainty and constraints on household water rationing and increased the price of private tankers. Federal and provincial authorities and the media see this as beneficial to rooting out corruption and improving security. But within targeted informal settlements, there has been intensified exclusion and embodied hardships despite the curtailment of crime and violence. Bringing paramilitary rangers into the broader schema of managing water supply in Karachi exemplifies an instance of security premediation in a 9/11 context, where the control of an uncertain future is sought by the judiciary, the media, and the security state. Poignantly, premediation has become a human security disaster, disrupting ordinary citizens such as Nusrat's daily lives and feeding feelings of insecurity in a landscape where histories of violence persist and where informal water provisioning systems, now destroyed, have long been relied upon. In the resonating fiction of a disastrous terrorist-controlled water future, the urban majority are being drawn into a frame of mind influenced by speculative security imagination. And informal settlements are perceived as sites of an inexact catastrophe lurking just beneath the surface. Spaces where informal water infrastructures exceed risk calculations, where premediation seeks to prevent a future where water mafias, militants, and terrorists rule. But in this fantasy of control, discourses of security also enter the unknown of the emergent city, where different realities are messing around with each other. Hence, I've borrowed from the language of security to try and understand or to sense things that are in movement and in formation in a city like Karachi, especially in a context where the state itself doesn't seem to cohere as we might expect it to, and where state officials are increasingly overwhelmed by the workings and complexions of informal infrastructures. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Right, that's great. Thank you so much, Nausheen. This was a fantastic talk, and the intermingling of the coming together of gendered patriarchal structures and the state patriarchalization was really interesting. So we have, again, another 10 minutes or so for questions. Feel free to raise your hand. And then we have Kathy first.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Nausheen. That was incredibly interesting, and I really liked your theorization around it as well. I thought it
An
was
attempt
really,
to theorize.
really interesting. I guess my point, or my question, revolves around how you deal with this militarized patriarchal state from a feminist perspective. How do you deal with it? Because it does sound, incredibly dominant. And I'm just thinking about, potentially thinking about the idea of, small acts of resistance, or how do you deal with these mafias on a daily basis from a feminist perspective?
Well, okay, so it's a huge challenge, right? So the majority of the time, the difficulties also arise. So women, this is one of the things that Amira and I were investigating, and there's not enough time to talk about it. So during our research on ground, we did come across situations where groups of women gathered together to resist these water mafias, the valve men, to try and go to the local water utility board or the local union councillor and to talk about the fact that, listen, we haven't had water for 3 weeks in our household and we have a right to water. But that form of resistance, which often becomes violent, not because the women turn to violence, but because security forces arrive, in a matter of minutes to kind of hold back these forms of resistance, also overlaps with other kinds of security issues. So this whole sort of men policing women's bodies. So we often came across women who would say, well, the kind of women who participate in those, in those affairs of resistance are generally women that really can't be respected because, and we're talking about, when we talk about the urban majority, as Abdul Malik Simon very clearly clarifies, we're talking about lower middle class, working class, poor, and the lower middle to lower middle class category, which kind of always blurs the boundaries. So the notion of respectability that especially young women, whether they are married or unmarried, cannot be seen outside in public spaces. And these are dense, informal settlements. So the question of density, the question of public spaces, to be seen hanging around in public spaces, and there's a lot of work, Ayana's own work has touched on these issues, along with many other feminist scholars working not only on South Asia, but other parts of the global South also. So this issue also becomes, very, we observe it clearly, and it's very pervasive. So both these this double whammy of security, right? So there's this other security issue, which is, well, women shouldn't step out of the confines of their home, and then the securitization issue, that when you do start forming groups of resistance, collectivities around these kinds of issues, it doesn't take long in the Karachi context for paramilitary forces and the police to arrive to break up this sort of stuff. So we're looking at a very specific kind of securitization issue in Karachi. This doesn't mean that it's not happening in other parts of Pakistan, but in Karachi it's particularly amplified because Karachi has been Pakistan's security laboratory for well over 5 decades now, for a wide variety of reasons, which kind of tie up with wider nationalist discourses of securitization and so forth. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. Nabila?
Hi, thank you so much, Nausheen. That was fascinating. My question was just moving a little bit away from the water aspect, of course. Your work reminded me a little bit of Rachel Payne's kind of spectrum of violence and this idea of how we misprioritize different registers of violence and different scales of violence, and domestic violence is seen as less important and inferior in terms of attention and funding to terrorism. But as you so aptly capture, water contamination kills more people than terrorism in the context of Pakistan. So I was wondering about that kind of relationship between this masculine, securitized, militarized policing of bodies when it comes to domestic violence, and kind of what's the relationship there? I imagine it's obviously, again, a deprioritized kind of issue, but...
Well, definitely surrounding water. So this was, in fact, one of our findings, that when, under those circumstances where water shortages become particularly profound and water scarcity is persistent, and again, didn't have enough time to talk about that other particular point that I was trying to make, that I just highlighted very briefly. In the surveys that we carried out, in the wider ethnographies that we did, domestic violence actually becomes a very viable and a very pronounced effect within the household, and typically over water. So, and it is usually a situation where women are held responsible within the home, that you have to take care of the water. If so much water was brought from the water tanker chap, or so many bottles were brought from the water utility board, then you have to be held responsible in terms of how you manage it. So, and it's never enough, and that's what women explain, that it's never enough. This is the kind of everyday infrastructure need that cannot be fulfilled just on the basis of so many jugs and so many liters of water, because we needed to clean our households and we needed to bathe our children. So if we've gone 5 days without bathing, or sometimes even 2 weeks without cleaning the household and bathing, and then the husband comes home and he says that, look, I just bought the water 2 days ago, and where is it gone? And then there are conversations that women have had with us that often it sort of delves into issues of domestic violence, where over water-related issues, women are always held responsible. So this whole, this blurring of the boundary between the public and the private also is a very important one. And especially in South Asian context, in cities in South Asia. I can't speak for Southeast Asian cities or African cities. My familiarity is more in terms of the region where I work. So this blurring of boundaries very quickly sort of, this leakage that occurs in terms of different kinds of violence. So the private space, that intimate space itself, often becomes a space of violence over these kinds of infrastructural dynamics.
It's a great answer. Any other questions? No. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nausheen.